Welcome to Trench Diaries. This is Battleship Bismarck Part 22. Our list to port had increased a bit while the firing was going on. Around 0930, gas and smoke began to drift through our station, causing us to put on gas masks from time to time. But it wasn't too bad. Unable to leave our station because an inferno was raging outside, we knew little about what was going on elsewhere. Was the ship's command still in the forward command post? Was Lindemann still in charge there? No reports came down to us, nor were we asked what was happening in our area. We had not heard a single word from the forward part of the ship since the action began, but considering the large number of hits we had felt, there must have been some drastic changes. Suddenly, I heard Albrecht's voice on the control telephone. "The forward fire control station has to be evacuated because of gas and smoke," he said, and I immediately rang off, precluding any questions. I was surprised. I had assumed that the reason for the fire control being turned over to me was that the forward station was out of action. Had Albrecht been directing the secondary battery from there? Was his own station serving only as a place of refuge? I would not learn the answers to those questions until many years later. I was using all the telephone circuits and calling all over the place in an effort to find out as much as possible about the conditions of the ship. I got only one answer. I reached the messenger in the damage control center and asked, "Who has and where is the command of the ship? Are there any new orders in effect?" The man was in a great hurry and said only that both the first officer and the damage control engineer had to abandon the damage control center, adding that he was the last one in the room and had to get out. Then he hung up. That was my last contact with the forward part of the ship. Before 1000 hours, men who had to abandon their own station or protected rooms began arriving to take refuge in my station. Most of them came through the narrow emergency exit, where a perpendicular companionway led down to the aft gunnery reserve circuit space. They clambered up its iron rungs, the uninjured, the slightly wounded, and many so badly wounded that one could only marvel that they did it. We were lucky that my station was not hit. While heavy firing was still going on, I had the two small exit hatches carefully cranked open. I believed, and convinced the men, that it was better to take a chance on a few splinters than risk having the opening mechanism jammed by a hit. In fact, we were spared both shell splinters and fragments. Around this time, the order was given to scuttle and abandon ship, although I did not know it then. In fact, no such order ever reached me, but the situation on board compelled me to conclude that it must have been given. Nevertheless, I did not allow the men in my station to leave while shells were exploding all over the superstructure and main decks and ready ammunition was blowing up. To do so would have been nothing less than suicide. I did not give the order to leave until long after our guns had fallen silent, the enemy stopped firing and, presumably, the shooting had come to an end. By this time, our list to port was heavier than ever and starboard was the lee side. I called to the men to look for a place aft and to starboard on the main deck. Forward, there was too much destruction and the smoke was unbearable. The quarterdeck was out of the question because the sinking ship was too far down by her stern and heavy breakers were rolling over her from her port quarter. Those who made the mistake of jumping from that side or who were washed overboard in that direction were thrown back against the ship by the sea, in most cases with fatal consequences. Being the last one to leave the station, I went forward towards the searchlight control station, or rather towards where it had been. The scene that lay before me was too much to take in at a glance, and it is very difficult to describe. It was chaos and desolation. The anti-aircraft guns and searchlights that once surrounded the aft station had disappeared without a trace. Where there had been guns, shields and instruments, there was empty space. The superstructure decks were littered with scrap metal. There were holes in the stack, but it was still standing. Whitish smoke, like a ground fog, extended from the aft fire control station all the way to the tower mast, indicating where fires must be raging below. It obscured anything that was left on the superstructure. Out of the smoke rose the tower mast, seemingly undamaged. How good it looks in its grey paint, I thought, almost as if it had not been in the battle. The foretop and the upper anti-aircraft station also looked intact, but I well knew that such was not the case. Men were running around up there. I wondered whether they would be able to save themselves to find a way down inside the mast. The wreckage all around made it impossible for me to go any farther forward, and I returned to my station only to leave it again immediately and go aft. I had to clamber over all manner of debris and jump over holes in the deck. I saw the body of a fleet staff officer lying there peacefully without any sign of injury. He must have left his station when the order was given to abandon ship without waiting for the enemy fire to cease. Turret Caesar, its barrel at high elevation and trained towards our port bow, was apparently undamaged. The light, shining grey of its paint contrasted oddly with the surrounding devastation. Its commander, Lieutenant zur See Günther Brückner, was forced to stop firing when his left gun barrel was disabled. Then, Brückner directed the following words to his turret crew. "Comrades, we've loved life, now if nothing changes, we'll die like good seamen," and ordered them to abandon the turret. From the upper deck I saw turret Dora, blackened by smoke, trained port side forward. A shell burst had shredded its right barrel, but the gun captain, Oberbootsmannsmat Friedrich Helms, had still fired 2 shots from the left barrel. Then Mechanikersmat Ernst Moog had climbed up from the interior of the turret, shouting that turret Dora was burning and the whole crew, still uninjured, had to abandon it, so the turret fell completely silent. Later still, a shell detonated, probably on the battery deck, and hurled the hatch to the munitions chamber high into the air. Helms and others suffered burns to their faces and hands through the jets of flame that shot up. Moving on, I glanced across the water off our starboard quarter and couldn't believe what I saw. There, only around 2,500 meters away, was the Rodney, her 9 guns still pointing mistrustfully at us. I could look down their muzzles. If that was her range at the end of the battle, I thought not a single round could have missed. But her guns were silent now, and I didn't expect that they would go into action again. The King George V and the Rodney had steered towards the scene of the coming battle on course 110 degrees at a speed of 19 knots in line abreast formation with a distance of 1,200 meters between them, the Rodney to port of the King George V. Rodney had not attained her design speed of 22 knots for several years, but during the last 3 days she had nevertheless averaged between 20 and 21 knots. Through the consequent vibration, she had lost some of the rivets in her hull, with the result that fuel oil was leaking into the sea and leaving a thin coating in her wake as far as the eye could see. At 08:43, the sharp grey silhouette of Bismarck, making an estimated 10 knots, appeared out of a dark rain squall 250 hectometers to the southeast, and Rodney's captain, FHG Dalrymple Hamilton, a man of few words, spoke only 5 to his crew. "Going in now, good luck." Then Rodney had opened fire, followed a minute later by the King George V. Another minute thereafter, Bismarck had replied. In the Rodney, men realized that they were facing a German battleship which, while incapable of maneuvering, had all her guns fully intact, and a gunnery officer who was probably hoping quickly to eliminate the heavy batteries mounted exclusively on the foreship of his principal opponent and therefore dangerously exposed by his bow-on approach to the Bismarck, and perhaps to need only a few salvos to do so, as against the Hood 3 days ago. For must not Schneider, well aware of the frightful penetrating power of the Rodney's more than 2,000-pound shells, force a quick decision in order to survive? But he could attain such a success only if, despite the Rodney's extremely small silhouette in the opening stage of the action, his observations enabled him to find his target right away. To continue, in the words of an observer aboard Rodney, from about 09:36 until cease-firing at 10:16, Rodney steamed back and forth by the Bismarck at ranges between 2,750 and about 4,500 yards, firing salvo after salvo of 16-inch and 6-inch during this entire period. The trajectories of the shells were nearly flat, and the devastation of Bismarck was readily visible to her enemies. Several fires were raging, and the back of turret Bruno was missing. The superstructure had been destroyed, men were running back and forth on deck, vainly seeking shelter, their only escape from the hail of fire being over the side. Around 1000 hours, Bismarck appeared to the British to be a wreck. Her gun barrels pointed every which way into the sky, and the wind drew black smoke out of her interior. The glow of fires on her lower decks shone through the holes in her main deck and upper citadel armor belt. To Tavy, it appeared almost incredible that Bismarck was still afloat. The knowledge that German long-range bombers or German U-boats might appear at any moment made the urgency of sinking her ever more pressing. Moreover, his flagship and Rodney were running alarmingly low on fuel. Repeatedly, he urged Patterson, get closer, I can't see enough hits." In order to hasten the end of Bismarck, Rodney fired 3 full salvos with her 40.6 cm battery at full depression, scoring 3 or 4 hits per salvo. At a range of 2,700 meters, she released her last 2 torpedoes, and the Norfolk, at a range of 3,600 meters, fired her last 4 torpedoes. But Bismarck remained afloat. In Rodney, Senior Lieutenant and Air Defense Officer Donald C. Campbell had been able to observe the whole course of the engagement. The highest man aboard in his storm-tossed action station in the lofty, unarmored anti-aircraft director, he had an unimpaired view from which no German aircraft appeared to distract him. He saw the first salvo of Rodney fall far ahead of Bismarck, presumably the result of overestimating her speed. The second British salvo fell just a little closer, and not until the third was one satisfactorily short. From the beginning, Bismarck's shooting impressed him as excellent by any standards and almost aroused fears of a repetition of the Hood disaster. The first German salvo was around 180 meters short and drenched the Rodney with a spray of evil-smelling water. The second, roaring over like 50 express trains, struck the water with a deafening detonation around 300 meters in her wake. Campbell could follow the flight of the British 40.6 cm shells with his naked eye, black dots growing smaller on their trajectory. As the 5 dots from the Rodney's fourth salvo were on the point of vanishing, he was horrified to see the number almost double, as Bismarck's third salvo appeared on a reciprocal trajectory in a two-way race for seconds to shatter the enemy's armor and morale, a breathless duel that would decide life and death. And that the Rodney would win, for her 5 shells raised only 3 waterspouts, and Bismarck's turret Bruno disappeared behind flame and smoke after the impact of 2 shells, while to Campbell, Bismarck's oncoming shells grew in size. He could even see a coppery gleam from their driving bands. He thought of the fate of the Hood and, in futile reaction, ducked his head. And then they hit, our third salvo, a straddle, a perfect straddle, port and starboard amidships, throwing great walls of dirty water over Rodney, but not scoring a direct hit, missing her by a hair's breadth. One of the many splinters flying around, a fist-sized chunk of red-hot iron, ripped into and around Campbell's directory, smashing instruments, gun-ready lamps, telescopes, and the master trigger for the anti-aircraft battery, and finally came to rest with a thud but, thank God, without harming one of the 5 men in the station. Not until that is one of them, Hambly, nicknamed Stupid Boy, picked up the 3 pounds of jagged metal to drop it with a yell, having badly burned his hand. Campbell reported the director out of action, put his guns under local control, and then gave his attention to how Rodney steamed through Bismarck's frightfully near misses, ahead, astern, and alongside, without even taking a hit. At 6,000 meters, he saw Bismarck's turret Anton explode into a blazing ruin, which meant that both Bismarck's 4 turrets had ceased to exist and only her secondary battery continued to shoot. Then Rodney could maneuver without any danger from Bismarck's defenseless bows. Horrified, almost stunned by the ongoing work of destruction, Campbell saw how Rodney's heavy shells crashed through the Bismarck's armored sides, how a 15.2 cm shell burst against her bridge like an egg against a wall, how another sent the top of her main fire control station spinning through the air like a giant trash can lid, where a yellow-white flame, like a scorching thunderbolt, consumed its own smoke and incinerated living and dead. Through it all, Bismarck's flag still waved, and Campbell cried out, "My God, why don't we stop?" And then, as if in answer, the ceasefire gongs rang. All that Campbell could hear then was the keening of the wind in the halyards and the wash of the sea against the ship's hull, as Rodney, the paint of her turrets blistered by 90 minutes of firing, her decks ripped by the tremendous blast of her guns, her guardrails bent by the same, withdrew from the scene of action, leaving Bismarck down by her smoke-shrouded stern, blazing fore and aft, a smashed but still beautiful ship. The Ark Royal's aircraft were anxious to get into the fight. 12 Swordfish were launched at 0926, but when they reached the scene of the action, they realized the risk they would be taking if they attacked. 4 ships were firing simultaneously at the German battleship from several sides at very close range. That meant flat trajectories, and the Swordfish had to fly low to launch an attack. It was much better for them to forgo it. Meanwhile, Tavi became increasingly irritated by Bismarck's refusal to sink. She endured a hail of shells, such as he could not have imagined. How much more would it take? How much more time would her obstinacy cost him? He had no more time. His fuel supply was almost exhausted. Every additional half hour he spent on the scene would make his return home that much more hazardous. Once again, he examined Bismarck through his binoculars. She lay deep and sluggish in the water. It now appeared certain that she could never reach port. And with that certainty, he had to be content. At 10:15 he ordered Rodney to follow in the wake of King George V on a northeasterly course at 19 knots. It was the course home. At 10:22, Admiral Somerville with Force H, out of sight to the south of where the action was, ordered the Dorsetshire to torpedo Bismarck. 2 minutes earlier, Captain Martin, acting on his own initiative, fired 2 torpedoes at Bismarck's starboard side at a range of 3,000 meters. One was observed to hit below her bridge, the other astern. Thereafter, the Dorsetshire went over to the battleship's port side and, at 10:36, launched a third torpedo at 2,200 meters. This was the last of all the projectiles fired at Bismarck on May the 27th. Suppressing the desire to retrieve a few personal belongings from my stateroom, which was not far away on the port side, I joined a little group of men assembled to starboard, forward of Torre Dora, where they were waiting to jump overboard. For the moment, that seemed the best refuge. Many men were already in the water, and those with me were wondering whether this was the moment for them to jump. I told them to wait. There's still time. We are sinking slowly, the sea is running high and we'll have to swim a long time, so it's best we jump as late as possible. I will tell you when. Before joining the group, I had seen King George V and Rodney steaming away to the north in line ahead and concluded that they would not take part in rescuing our survivors. But that other ships would do so, I was firmly convinced. Some ship will surely come along and pick us up, I told my companions, but I had no idea which it would be. Had I given them false hope? Looking around us far and wide, I saw only empty ocean. The ocean. Yes, it would soon accept us and, to all appearances, bring an end to us. Could this really be all there was? My death for Hitler and, as I saw it, against Germany? This merciless failure of my one-time expectation of someday being able to serve a normal state system? Was the closing balance of my life really to be the perversion of national life, the extinction of all one's own conceptions of the German way, the desiccation of Germany into a spiritual desert as a result of a dictator's insane excesses? I did not want to believe it. God would not allow it. He would still give me a chance not to have to see my life as a senseless waste. He would do it, and from that moment I had no doubt that I would be saved. My thoughts also went back to Berlin once again. Hitler would be sitting in his Reich Chancellery and someone would give him a brief report on the sinking of Bismarck. How angry he would be. Hadn't he told Räder often enough that he would much prefer keeping his handful of big ships at home rather than baiting the superior British fleet on the world ocean, especially by sending them out on contemptible operations against merchant ships? But the Grand Admiral would not listen and thick-headedly kept biting off more than he could chew. And now, this loss, moreover, of a ship bearing the name of the founder of the Reich, what a needless loss of prestige. It would make him absolutely furious. 2,000 men would die with the ship. Would anyone mention that to him? Would it interest him at all? Interest him if 50, 500 or 5,000 men died at one stroke? I thought not. Aside from Hitler's theatricals, Rauschning's conversations with Hitler, which had just been published, were still fresh in my mind. When I sent the Germans in their prime of life into the storm of steel of the coming war, as Rauschning recorded one of Hitler's remarks, I will not feel the least regret over the precious German blood that will flow. Obviously, I felt no human sacrifice would be too much for the maintenance of his personal power. It's striking, Hitler's army adjutant, Major Gerhard Engel, recorded in his diary after some weeks, how little, when he comes to speak of it, the fate of Bismarck appears to affect the Führer. No, when I went overboard, it would definitely be without a Sieg Heil, without a Heil Hitler, without an arm upraised in the Nazi salute, without any sort of gesture and reminder of the worst enemy Germany ever had. My powerlessness prevented anything stronger than this unobserved quid pro quo. Although we all must have heard many of the same terrifying sounds and must have shared a sense of incredible desolation that morning, we did not all have the same experience or see the same things. Here then are accounts, in more or less their own words, of the events that stand out most vividly in the memories of some of the other survivors. Soon after the battle started, water began pouring through the ventilator shafts into Junack's action station, the middle engine room below the armored deck in compartment 8. It was clear that the enemy's shots were striking close to us. After a while, red-orange fumes coming through the ventilators forced the crew to put on gas masks. The bridge issued hardly any orders over the engine telegraph, but when the din of battle was reduced to an occasional explosion, Junack received the order through the engine control station. Clear ship for scuttling. That was the last order given aboard Bismarck. At this moment, the entire communication system broke down, the central turbine room was cut off from the engine control station and the bridge. When scuttling charges had been brought to the cooling water intakes and things became quieter above, Junack sent his best petty officer to get further orders. The petty officer did not return, and Junack had no choice but to act on his own responsibility. He had all bulkhead doors to the shaft allays opened, then sent his men to the main deck and ordered the chief machinist to set the charges with a 9-minute fuse. He was the last to leave the engine room, where the lights were still burning and the turbines turning in accordance with the last order, slow ahead. Not until he reached the battery deck did Junack see the devastation of the battle. As he made his way through the wreckage, he heard the charges in the engine room exploding. There was no getting forward, and on his way aft, he ran into a crowd of men, scared because they found their passage blocked. Telling them not to panic, he pushed his way into the midst of them, and as soon as they realized he was an officer, they calmed down. They tried to shove their way through an unarmored hatch that was jammed half open, but their gas masks and inflated life jackets made it a tight squeeze. Things went faster when, at Junack's suggestion, they took off their life jackets and jettisoned whatever other equipment they had. He had mastered the chaotic situation at a glance. Junack waited until last to climb through the hatch to the upper deck. There, 5 junior officers and several hundred men were gathered around the aft turrets, getting ready to go over the side. By this time, the enemy was doing very little firing. A curtain of flames amidships hid from view what was forward of it. All he could see were some dead and wounded scattered about the deck. Our ensign still flew from the mainmast, but seawater was spilling over the quarterdeck in the brilliant sunshine, and the ship was sinking ever deeper. There was no doubt that Bismarck was slowly capsizing. Far aft, the leader of Damage Control Team No. 1, Stabsobermaschinist Wilhelm Schmidt, could tell whenever our guns fired by the shuddering of the ship. 5 enemy shells penetrated the upper deck in the area of his responsibility and exploded on the battery and main decks. One landed in compartment 1 and another in compartment 2, where it produced a huge flash. Nitrogen gas seeped through the closed armored hatch to the vicinity of the damage control command post in compartment 3. Shell splinters from the third hit put the lighting and ventilator from the main deck out of action. All that was left was emergency lighting. Hits 4 and 5 were in compartment 4, where, among other things, they demolished the companionways. Fumes from fires penetrated everywhere. A runner arrived from the damage control center with an order to Schmidt to send some men to put out a fire on a superstructure deck aft. A party went, but none returned. Schmidt had already lost some of his people to shell splinters. A chief gunner rushed up with the news that there was fire in turret Dora, and Schmidt, reversing pump number 2, flooded the ammunition spaces below the turret. Schmidt continued to receive reports of fires, some of them on the superstructure decks and in compartments on the battery and main decks. Finally, the order came from the bridge to all areas: scuttle the ship. Schmidt reversed whatever pumps were still in operation in his area and flooded the compartments. He heard the condenser intakes and the sea cocks blowing up in the engine and boiler rooms. A messenger brought another order: all hands on the upper deck. All the armored hatches on the main and battery decks were jammed and the companionways gone. The only way they could get to the upper deck was by using a narrow shell hoist. When they reached topside, Schmidt and his men joined the life-jacketed men waiting on the quarterdeck. Bismarck was laying in heavy seas, fire and dark columns of smoke belching from a superstructure. There was no sign of the enemy near or far, only a few wheeled aircraft circling overhead. The final battle is going on, and we hear about many survivor accounts. 2 things are already apparent. 1, Bismarck took a lot of fire but stayed afloat regardless, testament to the very good armor scheme. In the end, it didn't matter though, because the big ship's guns were silenced after a few minutes, making him combat ineffective. Afterwards, it was pure survival for every man on board. 2, the order to scuttle the ship had long been a matter of contention among historians, but here we learn that it was given without a doubt. In the next episode, we will hear more stories and learn about the massive chaos and destruction which befell the ship. I will see you then. Cheers.